can pursue. Now, what is the definition for a small business? You hear a lot of things thrown around in the media. We call things small businesses, but what truly meets that definition, so to speak? Well, a small business can be defined as a business that is independent and has relatively little influence on its market, meaning that the decisions that it makes in terms of its pricing practices, in terms of its marketing and those different things, have relatively little influence on the market. Now, obviously, by definition, someone like maybe a large retailer such as Walmart, whose decision making obviously has a ripple effect throughout the entire industry, would not be considered a small business. One thing I like to point out is, according to the Small Business Administration, a small business is a company that has less than 500 employees. So that could be another definition or another litmus test you can hold up an existing business against to see if it would classify under the realm of a small business. Now, a lot of times we ask ourselves, what really is the importance of small business in the U.S. economy? You've seen probably a lot of things in the media pertaining to how do we assist small businesses in creating jobs? How do we give them the tools, the resources that they need to ultimately hire employees, to expand operations, to continue operating? And that's because a number of different things. First of all, is a lion's share of the job creation is done by small businesses. I believe it's somewhere between 50 and 60%. So although the conception or the idea is that these large companies, these Fortune 500 companies, Apple, Google, Amazon, Walmart, they have thousands and thousands of employees, they aren't responsible for as much job creation as a lot of the small businesses. Now, this is also due to the fact that there are a significant greater number of small businesses than there are some of these larger type corporations. And as we've seen with legislation and different acts that have been approved, there's been a great push to try and get the resources to small businesses so they can ultimately create jobs. One of the big issues that happened as a result of this recent economic recession that we started back in 2008 is there was a crisis of credit. And credit, if you remember, originally was very free, was very easily attained. You didn't really have to have a great deal of requirements or proof that you could ultimately repay a debt. There were a lot of lenders that would give credit solely based upon your signature. They wouldn't ask for income or statements of income to prove that you can pay it back. They really didn't require significant FICO scores or credit scores, as they're commonly referred to. And they didn't necessarily look at your past historical payments, so to speak, because the mentality was at that point in time that housing values would always increase in value, so there would never be an issue where you would have to give up your home, so to speak, or not be able to repay it. And interest rates were also at pretty much prehistoric lows for the most part. And as we kind of gravitated through the housing bubble collapse and all those different things, lenders started to restrict their extent to which they would lend money. And that impacted small business, because small business is the one that relies on access to credit markets in order to hire, in order to continue to operate, in order to expand. So a lot of push has been recently gone to how do we open up the access to credit for these types of small businesses so they can continue to operate. Small businesses are also responsible for a lot of innovation. A lot of the things that we've seen in terms of new technologies and new products have been developed by small businesses. A lot of times the technologies that we use today were acquired by larger companies. Companies like Apple and Google and these different technology companies spend a great deal amount of money trying to acquire some of these smaller companies to utilize the technologies that they've created. So small businesses are responsible for a lot of innovation as well. And small business has a great contribution to big business. As I said before, a lot of large companies, a lot of big businesses will acquire some of these smaller companies because of the technologies that they've worked on, the initiatives that they've kind of championed, so to speak. So small business is extremely important. We've seen a lot of different advocates for small business recently. As of late, President Obama has even appointed the head of the Small Business Administration as part of his cabinet, just to kind of illustrate the importance of how this is in terms of jump-starting our economy. So let's transition over to entrepreneurship. Obviously the two are interrelated because entrepreneurs start small businesses. But what really is entrepreneurship essentially? Let's give you a good working definition so that you understand the concept moving forward. Entrepreneurship is essentially the process of seeking business opportunities under conditions of risk. Entrepreneurs would be the people that accept those particular risks. They're the people that have passion. They have a particular idea or a vision for something, and they're willing to accept the risk of potential failure in an effort to see that opportunity or that idea come to fruition. And entrepreneurs are extremely important to a society and to an economic system. We discussed in Chapter 1 going over some of the different economic foundations in the U.S. business environment, that an entrepreneur is one of the primary factors of production. And countries that don't encourage entrepreneurship have typically low levels of innovation. They typically have higher than normal unemployment. So entrepreneurs are extremely important to the economic well-being of a particular society. Now, a small business owner is a person that essentially would operate a particular business. Okay? So an entrepreneur sometimes is that small business owner, okay? But not always. And the reason that I say that is that an entrepreneur can actually start the actual business, but the small business owner is the one that operates it. So you see there's a disconnect sometimes between who starts the company, who has the vision for it, and who ultimately runs the operations. A great book in entrepreneurship that I do recommend anyone that's interested in learning more about it, or even potentially interested in possibly starting their own business and not sure kind of where to start, is E-Myth, which was written by Michael Gerber, and you can find it online for about $10 or so. It's a great book, one of the most read business type books in entrepreneurship of all time, so it's got a lot of great information. But one of the things they talk about is that the entrepreneur and the manager are two separate people. We often start businesses because we have a brief glimpse and a moment in time of what our life could be like if we were to start this, and we think that a lot of times we are maybe a sort of disenfranchised with our current roles and with our current employers, feeling like, well, we can do the same thing on our own. And the entrepreneur is the one that creates the ideas. They love to be looking in the future and those types of things. The business owner, which is more of a manager, looks in the past. They like looking at historical data. They like managing things, right? Organization, keeping things under order, so to speak. So an entrepreneur could be someone who starts the idea and then passes that along to ultimately a small business owner who can then run that once the idea has been put into place. Well, let's look at some entrepreneurial characteristics. Obviously, entrepreneurs are somewhat unique. One, obviously, is they tend to like a lot of risk, and that becomes a little obvious. First thing is they're typically resourceful. They're typically open-minded. They're open to new ideas, and that's extremely important in entrepreneurship because entrepreneurs are always looking for opportunity. And so if you're closed-minded, and if you don't have the ability to think on your feet, then you're not going to recognize a lot of different opportunities that come your way. It's extremely important to be open-minded. Now, one of the examples I've given in the past in my class that I teach here on Grounds is with regards to Steve Jobs. And Steve Jobs, obviously, as we know, was extremely successful, a great visionary, and was responsible for the creation of a lot of products that we know and love here today. And he was so open-minded that he would always be looking for new opportunities. And that's what led him to develop this graphical user interface and a lot of the technologies that we have today, is because he was always looking for the next thing. He was looking into the future to see what would ultimately change the landscape for the personal computing industry. Entrepreneurs are also concerned about good customer relations. Extremely important, especially in today's climate where we have Twitter, Facebook, blogs. We have multiple different avenues to express our opinions, our likes and dislikes about a particular product, service, or company for that matter. And so entrepreneurs need to be extremely cognizant of their relationships with customers. They need to have good relationships with them, build strong relationships with their customers, so ultimately that will increase the success of their particular business. Remember, when you're starting out, you're typically in a bootstrapping phase. And what bootstrapping is you're pretty much pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. You have minimal resources, you have no financial backing, you're doing things on less resources than most companies. And so you're trying to save money in different things. You don't have a lot of money to go around for these expensive marketing campaigns and advertising on television and billboards and things. So word of mouth, having good customer relations is really what's going to build a business for a young entrepreneur and a young startup. There's also a desire to be their own boss, and I think to some extent we all have this desire, right? We like to be unpestered, so to speak, in terms of our work. We would love to work uninhibited by a manager or boss, whomever that person may be. So there is this desire to be independent, to not have to answer to anyone, that is extremely attractive for a lot of successful entrepreneurs as well. Next is that entrepreneurs have the ability to deal with uncertainty and risk. I learned that a lot of people, particularly some students, do not like uncertainty. They like to know when things are going to be assigned, when they're going to be due, very much routine. Entrepreneurs are okay with uncertainty. They're okay with not knowing if I'm going to have enough money next month to go ahead and pay the rent or pay the lease. They're okay with things that aren't necessarily set in stone, and they have to be for the most part, because in the startup phase, nothing is set in stone. Now, they're also okay with risk. Risk obviously needs to be incurred if there's going to be reward. Obviously, we know that the greater the risk, the greater the potential reward, a la kind of the stock market. Obviously viewed as more of a risky investment, but viewed as something that you can have a greater return than if you were to invest in a savings account, CD, those types of things. So successful entrepreneurs need to be okay with risk. Now, I will say that there are varying degrees of risk, obviously. And by a society, as a culture, we are very risk adverse, meaning that we don't like to incur a significant amount of risk. And when I say risk, I don't mean careless risk that you're just betting everything and you haven't done your homework. Keep in mind that entrepreneurs have done a significant amount of work early on to determine whether or not, or at least hopefully, that their idea has a chance of being successful. There are feasibility studies that they conduct. There are business plans that they write, all for the purpose of determining whether or not their idea is feasible and if they can make money before they start investing significant time and energy into that particular idea. So it is calculated risk. And some people are more okay with certain levels of risk. Obviously, some people like myself may not be willing to mortgage the house, so to speak, and put potentially the family out on the street, no matter how good the idea is. Some people, they may be able to do that. So there are varying degrees of risk associated with that to keep in mind. Entrepreneurs also rely heavily on networks and business plans and all these different things. So someone that likes entrepreneurship and is good at entrepreneurship has the ability to really network, to really be social, and to work with their contacts. For some people, that could be really difficult because you're kind of getting outside of yourself. Maybe your personality isn't automatically predisposed to being very social. Some people, it's just more natural than others. But entrepreneurs have that ability. They know that their strength is in their networks, that ultimately they're going to be able to rely on certain people come a certain time and place. All right, now we're going to turn our attention to starting and operating a new business. Now, many people state that the first step is to craft what's called a actual business plan. A business plan, for those that don't know, is essentially a document that goes over, the different product, the opportunity, the market, how the implementation is going to be done, all those different kinds of things. Now, usually what I teach in my entrepreneurship courses is to develop what's called a feasibility study. And a feasibility study, the reason that you conduct it before a business plan is a feasibility study's main question is to answer whether or not the idea that you have can make money. We all have great ideas at many different times during the day. But the point is that can it make money? Is there a market for it? Do you have the technical feasibility to actually manufacture or market that particular product? What are people willing to pay for it? Now, obviously, just manufacturing a product for just making it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. You need to make sure that you can actually make some money on it. So the feasibility study asks those important questions, and it's designed to take an objective look at your particular product or business or idea and see if it's feasible to continue. And you want to do this early on, and it does take some work. because it can be a big time requirement because you're researching markets, you're researching industries, you're looking at trends, you're trying to be as objective as possible. What you don't want is making a decision about whether to go into business solely based upon your own opinion or the opinion of your family and friends. The reason being is that your family and friends will always tell you you have a great idea, because it's not fun to turn somebody down, right? It's not fun to say that your idea won't work. Few people are very quick to make such a critical claim, so to speak. And because of that, we get ourselves into situations to which we feel like people are encouraging us and this is a great idea, when we haven't taken a step back and looked objectively and seeing, can this really work? And that's what the true purpose of a feasibility study is. And that's why I always recommend conducting one of those first before you even get to a business plan, because a business plan is something you need for banks and those types of things, and arguably you don't need it for a few years, which I know that sounds kind of funny to say because we always preach about the importance of actual business plans, and we rarely talk about how important a feasibility study is. Now, when preparing an actual business plan, usually you're required to set some type of goals or objectives. The business plan primarily is a marketing tool and it's a finance tool, meaning that you're going to give it to banks, venture capitalists, and different investors so that they can get a good depiction and see if you actually know what you're doing. So you want to have some goals, you want to have some objectives. If someone's going to give you some money, they want to see how are we going to measure whether or not you actually use that money wisely. You do a little bit of sales forecasting with business plans as well. A sales forecast is essentially a fancy way of saying a guess, and they can be particularly difficult to do because of the fact that a lot of times when you're first starting out, you don't have any sales. So you really are kind of thinking of the numbers in thin air. Now, what I will mention is it's important to be realistic, not forecast that we're going to do $1.5 million in sales in the first couple months. Obviously not very realistic. A great goal, but you want to be realistic, of course. You don't want people looking at your business plan and just laughing at you and diminishing the credibility of everything that actually goes after that when it actually could be a good plan. But the second you put in some type of unrealistic number or goal, it immediately diminishes the credibility of anything else, and everything else is discounted after that. So some of the things you can do in that situation obviously is look for similar companies in similar industries. Look at companies that may be successful and larger now, but look at them when they operated back in their startup phase, back in their infancy, and see what kind of sales they were doing to get some type of measure on what to do. But ultimately, a lot of times it is a guess. We like to say that it's based on all these facts and figures, but it is based on someone's interpretation for the most part. The next thing is some type of financial planning. You know, how much money you're going to need. Why is that the amount of money that you need? How are you going to repay that particular investment? If I invest in your company, regardless of the amount that is, I want to see that you have some type of plan in place for me to get my money back, right? It's not just a gift. I'm giving it an expectation of getting something in return. So there has to be some type of actionable plan with regards to finances and when that investment is going to be returned. Now let's look at starting an actual small business. There's a number of different things that you can do to actually open up shop, so to speak. The first thing is you can buy an existing business. Okay, buying an existing business is something that's already operating, already has sales, already has employees, already has a brand name, right? People are familiar with it. The great thing about buying an existing business is there's a lot less risk involved. And the reason for that is that it's already been operating, right? So you can look at their financials. You can look at the books. You can see what kind of revenues they're bringing in. You can see what kind of expenses there are. So it allows you to take a more objective look in assessing whether or not you want to actually purchase this particular business. Now, what I also mentioned is that buying an existing business is a little easier because we're not so involved in it. Now, when people create something, particularly something that is their own, there's a sense of attachment. And I have a really difficult time giving up some control of my business or selling my business because it's essentially my baby. But an existing business, obviously there's not that complicated relationship involved. So you have the ability to take a look at it in a more objective fashion. Another opportunity that you have with regards to starting a small business is to franchise. Many of you are probably familiar with franchising. It's where you pay essentially a royalty to a established company like McDonald's, Burger King, Quiznos, Subway. There are a number of different franchises that are present. And you essentially purchase the rights to use their brand name, their image, their marketing materials. They give you the actual secret sauce, so to speak, and how they conduct operations and how they train employees. They basically give you everything in a huge manual that will tell you how to do certain things. And it's a great opportunity and it's a great advantage for franchising because it's a proven business opportunity. Obviously, we know McDonald's is hugely successful. So it's already been proven to succeed. So there's less of a chance of failure because of the fact that it already is an operation. People know it. McDonald's has a huge brand recognition, right? We all know the golden arches. Even if McDonald's wasn't attached the name after that, we have instant recognition because it's so popular. Another thing is you have access to management expertise. You have people who before you develop the standard operating procedures for how you need to do things because they know that's what works. And so there's less time that's spent trying to develop all of the different types of movements and things and techniques that need to be done to ultimately produce the product when it's already been planned out for you. So that is one of the advantages as well. It's very much plug and play, so to speak. Now, obviously everything has disadvantages, of course, and franchises have their disadvantages. The first is startup costs. Franchises require a significant startup cost. It depends on the investment or depends on the franchise. Obviously, something as well known as McDonald's, depending on the area, can run you hundreds of thousands of dollars to in the 1.2, 1.5 million, depending on the actual area. So that's a significant investment to actually start a particular franchise depending on the area you're going into. So startup costs are a definite disadvantage. Now, the next thing is ongoing payments. A lot of times you have to pay a percentage of your sales to the franchisor. And that's kind of a ongoing royalty, so to speak, for using their materials and all those different things. So that is another disadvantage, of course, because that eats into ultimately what are your profits. And lastly, management rules and restrictions. This can be both an advantage and disadvantage. Advantage from the standpoint that you don't have to create them. A disadvantage from the standpoint that you're very restricted. You can only do things a certain way. You're not allowed to deviate a whole lot. There are significant rules that go into place because the parent company, the franchisor, does not want you to do things that could negatively affect their brand. They don't want you coming up with new products that they did not approve. They don't want you marketing their product in a way that isn't consistent with the image that they're trying to portray. So there are a lot of different rules and restrictions which can be inhibiting, but also has some advantage associated with that as well. Continuing further, you can start a business from scratch. And this is a lot of times what a lot of people can do is start a business from scratch. You have an idea for a product or for a particular service, and instead of purchasing an existing one, going the franchising route, you want to go ahead and start it from scratch. And there are obvious advantages and disadvantages associated with that. Starting from scratch produces a higher risk of business failure. There is a significant percentage, I believe 60 to 70% of businesses fail within the first 5 years. Now, because of the fact that people that start businesses have ideas, but they're not people that can run businesses, right? It takes a special skill set to run a business. Different from what it takes to actually think of an idea for one, right? Do you have the skill set that's necessary to make this business successful and to grow it? And a lot of times entrepreneurs may not. They're great coming up with the ideas, but they're bad with the implementation part, which is extremely important as well. So that's why you see a very high risk of business failure, a very high amount of it. Advantages, obviously, is it's your own. You can put your own stamp on it. You can put your own personal flair to it. What you say goes. You don't have to check in with anyone, essentially. That's kind of your way or the highway. So that is definitely a positive and an advantage associated with starting from scratch. So some things you have to ask yourself when you're going to start a business. Any person that goes into business needs to ask themselves these questions in order to be able to get a good depiction on how they're going to do. The first is, who and where are my customers? This is something that's really answered in the feasibility study that we do. And that is trying to find out, do you have a market for this product? It's good to think of great ideas. That's a positive thing. But is there someone who's willing to pay money for it? And I always ask myself, don't ask people, or I always tell my students, don't ask people if your idea is good, because everyone's going to say it's great. No one's going to say that your idea is crap to your face. It's just kind of human, kind of our tendencies. We don't like to do that, so to speak. I kind of refer to it as the American Idol syndrome. We don't like to tell people they're bad, and they go along for years and years thinking they're great. They go on American Idol, and the judges say, you're horrible, and they're surprised by it because everyone along the way has said, this is great, you're going to be big, because they don't have the courage to necessarily say otherwise. So the problem here is don't say or ask if your business is a good idea or if your product is a good idea. Ask people if they'll buy it. How much would they pay for it? The second that you put money at stake, that I have to now give up something, it changes, right? My mentality changes towards it. Sure, everything's a great idea, but would I pay money for it, right? Ask them, okay, tell you what, if you give me $20 now, when I produce this, you'll be the first person to get it. And see what happens at that point. It could be a little awkward, right? You could see a shift. Right before it was a good idea, but I definitely don't want to pay for it. And you want to see if people will buy it. That's the important thing there. I went over this before. Obviously, how much will you pay? It's extremely important because just because someone will buy something, it doesn't mean that they'll buy it for enough to cover your costs. We all have expenses that go into different products and services. And if you can't get enough money to cover your costs, then there's not going to be there's not going to be a long time before you're going to be out of business because you need money to be sustainable. How much product can I expect to sell? Very important that you gauge the potential market. You take a look at the demographics. You take a look at the number of potential consumers that are in your geographic area, and then whittle that down to the percentage that you expect you can attract, and then determine what your market is. And that's important not only for production purposes, but it's important for staffing purposes and all different kinds of things. Who are my competitors? What a lot of people fail to do is they think of the direct competitors, right? If I start a food company or I start a restaurant, I think of nearby restaurants and things. But you don't think of indirect competition, right? Indirect competitors meaning anything else that I can use to satisfy my need for food. So not necessarily just restaurants, but grocery stores and all these different things. So you do have to consider indirect competition as well, because if I do one thing, if I purchase food from a grocery store, that inhibits my ability to go out for dinner possibly, right? Because I'm not going to necessarily do both all of the time. And lastly, why will customers buy my product rather than competitors? There has to be a difference. If you're offering the same thing, if it's not different enough, people won't adopt. We've all seen Google Plus, for example, came out within the last few years or so. And initially, there was a high number of people that adopted it. But what we found is that a lot of people, although they adopted it, didn't use it. It was like a ghost town. You'd see tumbleweeds on there because people were already using Facebook. And you've already invested all of your time, energy, tweaking Facebook and putting things on there and photos. And you have all your friends and family and all those different things. And to think about having to recreate that can be extremely difficult. So the problem with Google Plus is it wasn't different enough, at least in the early stages, to really gain a mass following, so to speak. It was pretty much Facebook with circles, right? You can put people into circles, which you can do in Facebook anyway. So your product has to be different enough from the competition. Otherwise, people are not going to be willing to adopt it. Let's talk a little bit about financing here real quick. Financing, there's a number of different ways that you can use to take money and to put it into your business. The easiest thing to do is to obviously use your personal resources, i.e. your own money. This is predominantly what people do, right? You save up some money, you have some set aside, and you use it into your own business. So obviously one avenue of financing. Second, you can take loans from family and friends. This is one option. I always counsel people not to do this. Because the reason for that is it changes the dynamics of the relationship. It's really interesting when you're sitting at Thanksgiving dinner across the table from your debtor, someone that you owe money to. And no matter what you say, it changes the relationship on their part too, because they're going to evaluate the decisions that you make based upon, well, you have to pay me this money, so why are you going on vacation? Even though that may not be said. So I always counsel people as a last resort, loans from family and friends. Gifts from families and friends are great. Things with no strings attached. This is a gift. I have no intentions of ever seeing this money ever again. Those are fine. But the second you start putting requirements and all these different things based upon the money, it definitely changes the relationship. So I would counsel anyone against that. Next are bank loans. Obviously, I mentioned before that banks are being a little more restrictive in terms of their lending practices. So this may be more difficult to obtain now because you have to have even a better FICO score than we did before. You need to have a great debt to equity or debt to income ratio showing that you can pay things back. So this may be difficult to actually obtain, but bank loans are one opportunity, of course, and with some of the initiatives that the government has been kind of championing, it should be a little less difficult to obtain loans for small businesses. Venture capitalists. Venture capitalists obviously are people that represent certain companies, have access to a lot of money, and are interested in getting a better return on that money than just, say, investing it into mutual funds or bonds or the certificates of deposit, savings accounts, those types of things. So venture capitalists typically have experience in certain industries. So they have a lot of business experience, but they're also wanting to get a better return on their investment. And they're willing to actually invest money, but typically they will want a percentage of your company in exchange. And the reason for that is they want to have the ability to affect the decision making of that company if they're going to give you money. They may not trust you entirely. They want to make sure that they have a voice in the operation. So if you do attract venture capitalists or venture capital money, be prepared to give up some percentage of ownership of your company in exchange. Next, and these aren't necessarily as common, but small business investment companies or opportunities or avenues to get money from. You have minority enterprise small business investment companies as well, which are very, very similar. And you have SBA financial programs or the Small Business Administration. They do have a variety of different financial programs that provide money to people wanting to start small businesses as well. All right, let's look at a couple reasons for successes and failures with regards to starting companies. And these are pretty much in opposition to one another. The first reason for failure is poor management. I mentioned a lot of times that people that start small businesses are what are called entrepreneurs, but on top of that can be called what are known as technicians, meaning that they're good at a technical task, right? The carpenter, the bricklayer, the computer programmer is really good at their job, and they feel that I'm not appreciated and I can do the work, so obviously that must translate to my ability to run a carpeting business or a bricklaying business or a computer programming business. Not necessarily, right? They're different skill sets, right? One doesn't necessarily lead to success in the other. And so when you do that, the effect of being now a manager and being in that role, the tendency is that I as an entrepreneur and I as a technician am going to downplay the importance of those managerial roles. And as a result, things like financial forecasting and marketing are going to take a back seat because all I really want to do is program computers, or all I want to do is lay bricks, or all I want to do is construction. I just want to be unhindered by the mere aspect of having a boss. Next thing is neglect. We tend to want to do things that we're good at, and few people that start businesses are good at all things. It requires a lot of hats. Not only are you the entrepreneur, the person that starts the business, but you're the manager, the person that actually runs it. And then you're also the technician, the person that does the work. The problem is, though, in terms of the makeup, predominantly most people are technicians, about 70%. We just want to do the work. And so we're going to neglect some of those other things because all we want to do is have a job, go to a job, and not be hindered by having a boss or someone in our face all the time. And the next thing is weak control systems. Weak control systems meaning there's no accountability. Like I said, people do not think in the future about how to do certain things. There's no standard operating procedures in place. It's kind of a flying by the seat of our pants, so to speak. So weak control systems is another primary failure for small businesses. And lastly, insufficient capital. Obviously, not having enough money to continue to operate is extremely pivotal and can be detrimental to the success of the business. So money is another reason why small businesses will fail. Let's look at some of the successes. It's always nice to end on somewhat of a positive note. First reason for success is hard work, drive, dedication. Those are pivotal. A lot of times in the startup phase, you're investing a significant amount of time, money, energy with no real financial return. And so the longer that you can sustain that and continue to operate, the better you will be later on, assuming you have a good business idea. Market demand. This is pivotal. Obviously, there needs to be a customer that is willing to purchase your particular product. If there's not demand for your product or service, then your business is not going to be successful. Next thing is managerial competence. You need someone in place that knows how to run a business. And if that is not you, that is fine. You just need to be aware enough with yourself to understand that you're not the guy or girl to do that. And if you aren't, you need to get somebody on your team that is. I've always said having a strong bench is important. Having people on your staff that have a complement of skills is important. You don't want 10 finance guys running a business, right? Because they're looking at things through that finance lens. They're constantly worried about costs and how do we increase profits and those types of things. They have no idea what it takes to design a great product or what it takes to market a great product. So you want people with complementary skills. That is very, very important. And the last thing I always like to add, of course, is just sheer luck. At some point we have to recognize that a lot of things are out of our control, and although we like to think that we're in control of our own destinies and those types of things, and that what we do is directly affected by our own inputs and what our results are, a lot of times it's just sheer luck. A lot of times it's being at the right place at the right time. That has a lot to do with it. So we would be a little naive if we didn't think that there was some type of element of luck involved in starting businesses and being successful.